Welcome everyone to the fourth session of the Imami Art Design Histories of Modern and Contemporary India, a symposium series organized in collaboration with Professor Tapati Guha Thakurta. Before I introduce today's speaker, I would like to also thank our outreach partners, NID and JBMRC, Kolkata. Today we have with us Sarita Sundar, who will talk about her lecture is titled Two Chairs, an Ayurveda Man and April's Portrait, Objects from the Intersectional Design Histories between India and the United States. Sarita's practice and research spans heritage studies, popular and visual culture and design theory. At Hanno, her heritage interpretation and design consultancy, she combines 30 plus years of working with brand strategy and design solutions with her academic training in museum studies. Over the years, Sarita has engaged in research into Indian vernacular typography, to studies of intangible culture in performance practice. Her present research focuses on seating cultures in India and will culminate in a publication in collaboration with the Godrej Archives, Mumbai. She recently received the 2022-23 Fulbright Academic and Professional Fellowship to continue her work in Indian design histories. Sarita has a postgraduate degree in visual communications from NIT Ahmedabad and a Master's of Arts in Museum Studies from the University of Leicester, UK, where she received the Professor Eileen Hopper Greenhill Academic Prize. She was founding partner at multidisciplinary design company Trapeze before moving her practice and research interests to Hanno. She has taught and evaluated courses on the history of design in India, as well as practice-based courses at NID, Ahmedabad, and Bangalore NIFT, Bangalore, Srishti Manipal School of Design and Technology, Bangalore, IICD, Jaipur. She was faculty for the Winter School on the Public Life of Objects in February 2020, conducted by the Center for Public History. Welcome, Sarita. We also have Professor Tapati Guha Thakurta with us today. And the floor is yours for the evening. Some housekeeping rules. Everybody please type in your questions at the chat or question answer box, or you can also message us on Facebook, those who are joining us there. Sarita, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mushmita. And thank you, Tapati, as well as Imami Art, for inviting me to this symposium. It's such a privilege to be part of this incredible lineup of scholars and practitioners. And I have to say that at various points, I have referred to the work of nearly all of the speakers here for some of my projects. I'm just going to share my screen. Do let me know if there's a problem. Are we good? Can you see
yes,
my
Sarita,
screen?
We can hear you and see you as well. Thank you.
So as part of my talk, I will be presenting two primary ideas. One on the intersectional design histories between India and the United States. And secondly, of the many resistances to modernism that can be found within the educational, curatorial, and professional spaces in these two countries. The intersection of these two ideas is the primary theme of a project that's been supported by a 2022-23 Fulbright Nehru Academic Professional Fellowship. And I do hope to add information for this from institutional archives to validate some of the speculations I'm making. So what I'm presenting today is still a bit of a work in progress and a dip into earlier research inquiries. So do bear with me for any gaps, staccato jumps that you may find jarring. I really look forward to the comments, inputs, and conversations from the many scholars and participants at the end of this talk. For now, and for the purpose of this particular talk, I'm using the examples of 3 sets of objects across history: 2 chairs, an Ayurveda man, and April's portrait. And I'll sort of go into details of that as we go along. At the outset, and not just for the benefit of those in the audience unfamiliar with design history, I thought it best to unpack a few words, not just in the context of today's one. I've jumped. I thought it best to unpack a few words, not just in the context of today's talk, but in this series. I'll also zoom out and establish the reasoning for the association of design and modernism in India by introducing a bit of cultural and historical backdrop. As Professor Chatterjee mentioned in his talk, that while having the oldest unbroken design culture in the world, we have no precise word for design in the myriad Indian languages. And here I wish to add and qualify that the word that would actually precisely translate as the practice advocated by international modernist design. There are words like shilpi or craft, kala or art, and I'm introducing a word that I was just sort of recently came across that seems to take into account design as a problem-solving activity and thinking methodology, abhikalpa. Sorry. As Professor Chatterjee's statement that we have the oldest unbroken design culture in the world, I'd like to think that this statement is reaffirmed through this cave drawing created about 10,000 years or so years back in Bhimbetka. Whether these drawings were the markings made by a bored caveman while it poured outside, or whether he used it to rally his fellow cavemen to start the first milk cooperative, we may never know. But I do think its minimalist manner is very much in line with 20th century modernist ideas of universalism of form, the circle standing for continuity, and of a community coming together. And this quote, appropriate at this point, I believe, in the narrative, by modernist graphic and symbol designer Adrian Frutiger, who also taught at NID, reaffirms that the meanings of the simplest of forms, the square, triangle, and circle, are quite possibly common across cultures. It may also appear as though I'm digging my own grave, since in some ways this sort of statement alongside this image counters the argument I'm making later on. The profession of formally trained designers, as we know, it came to India only in the second half of the past century. The academic discipline of the history of design in India has an even shorter life, with a handful of professionals and academicians participating and teaching in it, and very little by way of written literature to dip into. And here I'm comparing the nascency of design history as a discipline to its very close cousins, art and architecture history. And while modern and modernity and modernism have been used equivalently, modern is used stylistically as an adjective to describe an object in current style. Modernity is to do with the contemporary and now. And on the other hand, modernism is more to do with the progressive turn away from the ills of the past, and is linked to the modern movement in capitals, which started in the late 19th century in Europe. However, modernism as a social and intellectual ideology can be traced all the way back to the rationalism and humanism of 17th century Renaissance in Europe. And then again, to confuse all this a little bit further, the international style, again in capital, is a movement that started post the First World War in the early 1900s, was associated with the distilling down of designs to a culturally neutral rather than a culturally specific style, supposedly in order to democratize society, but often ending up working for the benefit of dominant ideologies and groups. And again, modernism as an aesthetic finds its lineage in Alfred Lull's 1913 essay, Ornament is Crime. His controversial and often distorted quote, "The evolution of culture is synonymous with the removal of ornament from utilitarian objects," became the rationale for the radical, functionalist, and sometimes machine-based aesthetic of modernism. I will return to some of these ideas at various points in today's discussion and attempt to unpack the issue of why, for the longest time, to be a designer was to be so within the modernist idiom, particularly in the international style, until alternate and contextual modernism became legitimized closer to the end of the 20th century. So over the past 180 odd years, there have been a number of exhibitions of India, within India and outside of India, each truly reflective of not just the aesthetic of the period, but the overall political and cultural concerns, pushes and pulls between nations, individuals, and communities. The 1851 Great Exhibition in London offered a platform for the Occidental imaginings of an idealized vision of the Orient through Indian artifacts and hand craftsmanship. A similar one was held in America, a slightly lesser known one. And India was one of the countries that participated in this 1876 Centennial exhibition held in Philadelphia. The exhibition had a significant display of Indian artifacts, mostly supplied by the India Museum in London as part of efforts of the British colonial government to create economic demand for the products of its empire. Nearly 10 million visitors were offered insights into the culture and customs of people from far off India. A reviewer of the exhibition wrote about a piece of Bombay blackwood furniture, the little image that you see on the top. The carving on a charming open filigree to the last fraction of an inch, the tabletops and the flat plain surfaces upheld by stalks, the chair backs and other upright surfaces, a mass of indicated flow range. Not all critics were quite as enthusiastic. Some have attributed the style of ornamentation to the conventional grotesqueness of India and the tendency of the Hindu mind to indulge in extravagant and fanciful conception. Notwithstanding this mix of sort of praise and criticism, including the veiled colonial disdain, the exhibition facilitated international trade, understanding, and awareness. I won't go into too much of detail into all the exhibition, but just enough to offer a backdrop to the objects that we're talking about today. You will see that most of the objects are seats, and that's because that happens to be the subject of a sort of a publication that I'm putting together along with the Godrej Archives. So for instance, you see the magnificent ivory throne that was gifted by the Maharaja of Travancore in 1851 for the Great Exhibition in London. The other colonial seat featured is the Blackwood seats shown at Philadelphia, London, and Paris, which were referred to specifically for their ornateness as grotesqueness. You see the modern classic Marcel Breuer chair that I'll discuss in further detail today, which was shown during the show Design Today in America and Europe that traveled to 11 cities in India. An exhibition that was the direct result of the cultural diplomacy set into place during the Cold War by the United States. And much later, the Golden Eye exhibition put together by Rajiv Sethi that brought together international postmodern designers to work alongside Indian craftsmen, and that produced, as an example, the Fort Rose bench, which you see an image of, by Italian designer Mario Bellini, who worked alongside craftsman Kesaria Ram and designer Chandra Vijay Singh. Among the many visitors to the Philadelphia exhibition was a young American artist, designer, and brief partner of the well-known Louis Comfort Tiffany group. His name was Lockwood DeForest. Lockwood DeForest developed an interest in Indian crafts during his visits to Europe and exposures to the 1851 exhibitions and the Paris exposition. His interest motivated him to travel to India on his honeymoon, actually, not exactly charmed by the hastily applied veneer of Indian motifs on cheap copies of Western furniture, and quite captivated by the architectural detail in buildings, DeForest traveled north to Ahmedabad in search of authentic craftsmanship. A meeting with Muganbai Hati Singh proved fortuitous, and in 1879, the Ahmedabad Wood Carving Company was established. Hati Singh's experience in introducing Lockwood to the Indian heritage of wood carving and of sourcing craftsmen who adapted traditional designs to Western discernments for export to America proved extremely invaluable. And unlike earlier European traders, De Forest held great regard for the design and craftsmanship of his Indian partners. An elaborate system of coding, prototyping, and referencing was set into place. And you can see some of the sort of carvings, and they would number a panel and have two sets. One was kept with Hati Singh, one was taken by Lockwood to America. You also see an image of Umang Hati Singh, who's holding up for me a small glass plate of one of the furniture pieces that they had designed. So this alliance, I believe, can be seen as the first genuine, creative, and bold collaboration between the East and the West in the area of furniture design. The journeys and connections that started in the 19th century as part of the first wave of global modernism continued over the next century. Many more collaborations took place, even while the motivations and provocations for each were unique. Some were more celebratory and successful than others. Some were met with hesitancy and minor roadblocks, but a very sure outcome was a creative assimilation of Eastern and Western design elements. This particular chair by the Ahmedabad Wood Carving Company, I believe, is in many ways a very early postmodern expression. It's presently being shown at the Met Galleries, I don't know if it still is, in New York, and it features the traditional chase brass craft on a teak base and incorporates architectural pillars and finials that can be found in buildings of West India. The use of machine technologies, and I'm going to sort of go through this fast because I think this is a repeated sort of motif you'll see in a lot of sessions as part of the symposium. So the use of machine technologies alongside a craft-based ethic, a universalism of language that cut through societal barriers to reach well-crafted products to the masses, became core to the thinking that came out of the Bauhaus School that started in 1919 in Weimar, Germany. And between the war years, the Bauhaus School changed venues and leadership due to political pressures. But even after it closed down, it remained iconic for its ideas, methodologies, and styles that are now synonymous with modernism. And with the migration of its designers from Nazi-dominated sort of Europe to America, the international style traveled to America as well. So while modernism was, during the interwar period, was fueled by an interest in craft and a curiosity for non-Western art, by 1950, via the international style, the movement had distilled down to a culturally neutral, minimalist form containing sort of these minimalist formal solutions, holding on to a socialist or at least moral stance only in certain contexts. In fact, the Bauhaus School started with the idea, and in quotes, to create a new guild of craftsmen without class distinctions, which raise an arrogant barrier between craftsman and artist. While Tagore saw an affinity in the Bauhausian appreciation of craftsmanship and Indian tradition, he did, however, perceive intrinsic problems with Western modernism that linked progress to materialism and a skewed emphasis on technology. The uniqueness of Tagore is that he distanced himself from aligning entirely with any of these two sort of radical directions. That is, from a complete modernization in a Western sense and from a complete rejection of the West. He says, one must bear in mind that those who have a true modern spirit need not modernize, just as those who are truly brave are not braggarts. He goes on to talk of modernism as not being in the dress of Europeans or in the square houses with flat, straight wall surfaces. These are not modern, he says, but merely European. True modernism is freedom of mind, not slavery of taste. It is independence of thought and action, not tutelage under European school masters. Nonetheless, modernism did make entry and headway into India in response to and guided by state-driven resolve, with Nehru, the first prime minister, calling out for a modernity built on a global outlook, but grounded in an Indian foundation to create a self-sufficient nation. In 1959, Nehru spoke of the modern city of Chandigarh as being unfettered by the past and an expression of the nation's faith in the future. And so the commitment to a cherished past as a resource for transition that could avoid mimicry of Western modernism, as Tagore had set forward in Shanti Niketan, was waylaid for a while. Objective rationalism, particularly of the type of the international modernist style, was thought to provide much needed antidote to the sentimentality and gratuitous eclecticism that is found in Indian way of thinking, such as the critical reviews of Blackwood furniture that I quoted earlier. Objective analysis formed the basis of problem-solving methods to generate functional design solutions, to improve the quality of daily life for the common man through value-free universal forms. And the exhibition at MoMA in New York in 1955, the Textile and Ornament Arts of India, brought together not just the decorative arts, but also many diverse individuals with varied interests in India. It was here that the American designers, Charles and Ray Eames, met Indian cultural activists, and along with the League of Western Artists, Architects and Designers, were invited to participate in fashioning a progressive Indian modernism. In 1958, sponsored by the Ford Foundation and on request by the Indian government, the Eames toured India before laying out their recommendations in the India Report. The report's underlying spirit became the foundation on which the soon-to-be set-up NID based its philosophy of learning by doing, and the workshops funded by Ford Foundation became, and I'm quoting Professor Chatterjee, became the hothouses for experiments in design. Later on, the 1959 exhibition, Designed Today in America and Europe, which traveled across India, was significant in transferring, and I'm quoting from the brochure that accompanied the exhibition, it was significant in transferring global modern design principles, while simultaneously integrating India into a culture of mass production and mass consumption. Organized as part of the international program of New York's MoMA and funded by the Ford Foundation and the United States Information Service, it was one of many of American cultural diplomacy programs organized during the Cold War, one of the responses to what a US State Department official called the gigantic propaganda offensive of the Soviet Union. The exhibition traveled across India and was displayed in a geodesic dome designed by Buckminster Fuller, the American futurist architect and industrial designer. The catalog of the exhibition states that its aim was to bring the attention of the Indian public to the aesthetic values of the West in largely machine-made, mass-produced objects through the designs of European modernist masters. In so doing, it also aimed to, again, quote in inverted commas, portray an image of Western progress. Many of the designs in the exhibition were by American designers of the era, some who were either immigrants from the Bauhaus School in Germany escaping war-torn Europe, or at least influenced by the universal international style of modernism that was formulated in Europe. Objects, of which furniture made a very large part from the exhibition, remained in India, going on to become an important part of the repository from which students at the NID still draw inspiration. The 1928 Seska chair, designed by Marcel Breuer, is one of the most influential furniture prototypes of the 20th century. Designed, as I said, by Bauhaus industrial designer Marcel Breuer, and it was one of the 18 chairs that were part of MoMA's exhibition. And while the Seska was most likely the inspiration for the cantilevered form of Godrej's CH4 chair, which many of you would have seen still sort of can be seen in a lot of government offices, it is actually impossible to establish that the particular chair on display prompted possibly an enterprising Godrej technician to draw ideas from it, as actually was the intention of the exhibition, as laid out in the accompanying brochure. However, the design was certainly a nod by the technical team at Godrej to a general movement towards using the properties of industrial materials such as steel into their products. The CH4 revolutionized the office furniture industry, moving it away from the use of natural materials to the use of mass-produced industrial materials, minimalist styling, and advanced manufacturing techniques, all contributing to the neutral machine aesthetic vocabulary of modernism. You see on the left is Marcel Breuer's sort of the modern classic, and the image of the CH4. I'm going to cut into a little bit of personal history here. NID graphic design studio around the 1980s. We were in our second year of graphic design discipline. doing courses in symbol design and basic graphic design, both sort of classic courses that taught us in the very best of Swiss design principles to reduce, to take a form and use the minimal amount of ink on the paper to still communicate information on an object or an action. Over the years, a few generations of designers, including me, were taught the value of creating clean layouts with dynamic white space to direct the eye towards a cohesive block of text, balanced and positioned so as to aid legibility. We never really questioned whether these objective layouts were an anachronism against the existing vernacular norms that celebrated the particular, the dense, and the layered. We were introduced to isotypes, driven by a need to be universal. Isotypes are what you see in sort of most airport signage systems. Driven by a need to be universal, demanding an international system of typographic education. Our teachers were taught by the masters of Swiss graphic design, to name a few, Adrian Frutiger and Armin Hoffman, who incidentally taught at the Yale School of Design and was instrumental in taking international style modernism and the Swiss style to America. As students and practitioners, we habituated modern fonts that were devoid of any extraneous flourishes or swashes. The slightest hint of curlicues and other whimsical indulgences seemed an anathema to our recently acquired modern sensibilities. In our colonization by Eurocentric aesthetic sensibilities, we framed our now post-colonial eyes to look upon vernacular conventions and traditions as the other. If one did engage with the vernacular, they were looked upon as curiosities that were polar to the dominant and mainstream professional practice that we were now part of. I really imagine that these layouts would have given, the Swiss masters Frutiger and Hoffman headaches. When we stepped out for our chai breaks, this is after all what we encountered. Well, not Tamil Nadu, these things, but something similar in Ahmedabad. Wherever you encounter street typography in India, it's a celebration of styles cluttered together in gay abandon. The disconnect between what we were taught and what we saw on the streets was not immediately felt. Later, however, it did become the title of a paper that I wrote called Indians Don't Like White Space, that looks deeper into vernacular graphic design traditions that, far from universal, required an understanding of an age-old set of cultural and visual codes. The strong focus on order and clarity stemmed from a belief in our education, stemmed from a belief that design is a socially useful and important activity, that designers should define their roles not as artists, but for communicating objective information, such as the designs of isotypes, as I show you on the right, even though it resulted in rather incongruous designs, such as the one on the left, of a man in a turban in a dhoti. And I wonder if anyone can sort of guess what it is, but it was supposedly to indicate an Indian-style toilet as opposed to a Western commode. I really shudder to think of many sort of bathroom mishaps that might have resulted by people rushing to attend to their bio parades. However, we must remember, separate from the world of professional designers, exists a vibrant world of typography in vernacular languages. A striking example is Satyajit Ray's type designs in an aesthetic molded, I think, at Shantiniketan that Pinaki Ray sort of pointed us to so well and so evocatively. And I think Nia Tandapani is sort of looking and studying in South India now. Today, vernacular styles continue to evolve unfettered by any impositions by modern design sensibilities. One cannot help but wonder whether the design landscape in India would have been different if there was an equal contribution from vernacular design and art practitioners in the early years of formal design education, very much as envisioned by Tagore at Shantiniketan. This, the search for an Indianness has been a sort of persistent discourse in varied disciplines, and the iconic paper, Is There an Indian Way of Thinking?, looks at ideas of multiplicity and plurality. Ramanujan sort of uses an anecdote when explaining what he felt was a particular Indian way of thinking. He uses the example of an Irish riddle, which asks, are trousers plural or singular? And the answer being that they are singular on top and plural below. A very neat fielding of an answer, yes, but also very illustrative of the multiplicity and plurality of thought in Indian cultures. Concerns and a resistance to modernism, albeit sort of for different reasons, have been addressed within design schools and by a group of practitioners in America, even while the provocations are surely not the same as in India. Meanwhile, we at NID in the 1980s were still studying modern design principles as stipulated by the curriculum. Wolfgang Weingart sort of started new wave typography in the early 1970s at the Basel School in Switzerland. New wave, along with other postmodern typographical styles such as punk and psychedelia, arose as reactions to isotype or to the classic Swiss style, which actually remained popular with corporate culture. An American designer, April Grieman, trained at Yale, took her designs in a new direction, even though she was initially trained in Swiss sort of international style graphics, particularly in her use of color and photography. Inspired by the new wave typography, Grieman advanced the application of new and intriguing layout principles, while also simultaneously actually creating a bridge to the retro and vernacular designs of the 1980s. So back to when I was a student in NID in 1987, I've often wondered who put up April's poster in the NID studio, but it surely created a bit of a rumble. The full-length portrait was provocative in more ways than one, breaking every rule of what we were taught in the classroom, and along with other computer age inspirations, harked the possibilities of freedom from the tyranny of the layerless modern idiom. Without the immediacy or fickleness of today, the poster and others such as Cranbrook's, Catherine McCoy's remained in our consciousness for a long time. These images seem to hold a key link with Indian ideas of multiplicity and plurality, and to some things that we saw outside of our classroom. Even in America, April Grieman's poster, which is called Does It Make Sense, was alternately hailed as a radical advance in the art of poster design and condemned as pornographic, self-indulgent, and inappropriate. A life-size nude fold-out of herself, digitized into an array of computer pixels, the microscopic spots of light that make up computer images, the poster displays Grieman's naked body adorned with the graffiti of scientific symbols and photographs of exploding supernova. A brontosaurus reproduced from a TV image roams the figure's groin. A hand holding crystal ball sprouts from her head. A printed border exhorts the viewer to dance, make sounds, feel, don't worry, be happy. April Grieman and Cranbrook Academy of Art designers, such as Catherine McCoy, work towards merging what is within and what is without, at connecting the external representation of things with their inner essence or meaning using typography. They recognize the hypertextuality of a communication piece and encourage readers to contribute and participate to the construction of meaning, rather than delivering it as an absolute singular message through their designs. Very, very different from the international style modernism or the machine aesthetic of Bauhaus or the Swiss style. This opposition between what is on the surface and beneath, what is represented and what is real, is referred to as binaries in Western thought. And Jacques Derrida's deconstruction theory questions the binary that exists between the external representation of things and their internal essence. Catherine McCoy's Cranbrook poster, which you see on the screen right now, is an iconic example of deconstruction typography, a complete antithesis and resistance to the singular white space-filled international style modernist style. Her experiments with deconstruction question the binary that exists between the external representation of things and their content or internal essence. Cranbrook, to give a context, Cranbrook Academy of Art in Michigan and the Yale School of Art are sometimes referred to as incubators of mid-century modernism in America, but were also where the greatest resistances to modernism happened. Now, it's quite possible that Derrida was not concerned with anything beyond an hour's jet flight east of Paris. And even so, One can, I believe, find consonance in deconstruction theories and the Cranbrook approach with what is called the multiplicity in Indian thinking. The multiplicity that is also often unkindly, though possibly accurately, called inconsistency. This multiplicity separates text from absolute meaning, emphasizes dispersion over completeness, and shares metaphysical underpinnings with Michael Foucault's ideas of postmodernism. An example that reflects, I believe, the coexistence of binaries in Indian thought and representation is the 16th century chart of the Ayurveda Man, capturing what is understood then as physical anatomy alongside the metaphysical concept of chakras within a body, the mind-body connection. The textuality of Ayurveda validates it as an authenticated system of medicine as opposed to other oral healing traditions. And in this image, the Ayurveda man seems to be willingly imprisoned in text, passively permitting the text to speak for him. Postmodernist and deconstructivist ideas of dealing with the past are surely slightly different. While the first, that is postmodernism, embraces the past, the other, deconstructive ideas, chooses to ignore it in search of a more radical language. What is common to both is the concept of authority residing with the reader. For both Roland Barthes and Michael Foucault, the creation of a text is not the sole, the creator of a text is not the sole owner of a creation. And it is the reader who uses his or her own codes to negotiate the text, who also participates in its meaning. The question I ask is there a possible link between the American experiments that I've shown and the coexistence of binaries in Indian representation, Indian ways of representation and thought? Co-creation exists in the narrative styles of folk traditions, where audiences or readers of a performed text, performance traditions, not only get to witness the creation of an art piece, such as the creation of a kalam puja on the ground, and any sort of associated performance, but as participants are involved in the outcome of a performance. Many Indian narrative traditions seem to use a dense layering of content where the external representation of things reveal their internal essence or meanings. Traditional myths are decidedly non-singular and continuously weaving out of a linear narrative, breaking off into tangential mini-narratives like the Mahabharata before returning back to the main thread. While some vernacular and classical typographic renderings reflect this thought and representation, modern interpretations seem to have moved away from these inspirations, as the severity imposed by modernism and minimalist movements hasn't departed from professional practice. I show an example of the famous frieze in Mamallapuram, and which Padma Kaimal calls an example of the playful ambiguity that exists in Indian art forms, and what I believe can be called the comfortable coexistence of binaries. This sculpture is variously at one point called Arjuna's penance, at other points it's called the Descend of Ganga. You can sort of see here all that happening. And the particular tourist guide that you encounter on the day that you visit and his leanings will determine the story that you're told. And if you do choose to challenge him and speak of the other story that you may know of, you will be told rather calmly that it can be both, and why not? I end with a snippet of a conversation that I had with Catherine McCoy, whose work I've admired right from Eddie student days in 1980s, who along with MP Ranjan also provoked me to do a sidestep from practice into studying design histories in detail. An enamorment with universal modernism has stayed steadfast within Indian professional design circles, indeed, not just Indian, I believe, global. And it's only towards the end of the 20th century that a revival of interest in indigenous expressions initiated a leaning towards a local, contextual modernism in India. And it was only towards the beginning, I believe, of the 21st century, 70 years into the entry of professional design, that writing on design in India made headway. However, the writing was not as often, I believe, done by practicing designers and not always done from India. And that is why efforts such as what Ushmita and Tapati and the Amami Art has put together, efforts such as these are ever so welcome and needed. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarita. That was a brilliant presentation, and such a broad canvas. You have, we have moved back and forth from Mahabalipuram to the early exhibitions of the 1800s uh, to the modernist moment in the post-independent India, and how uh, different aspects and trajectories kind of come together and influence or create. I think where we are moving towards, towards the end of your presentation is towards a more eclectic and what you call a vernacular design system. And I remember having attended another lecture that you'd given at NID, which also particularly discussed the typography and the rise of the Indian vernacular design in typography. And in more recent years, and especially with the rise of the South Asian art and design cultures getting more of a credit internationally for especially the ecosystems within our regions, which have given rise to alternative ways of looking, alternative ways of making, not just in design but also in the fine arts, is gaining more and more purchase. And I think in that sense, what you discuss and how you point out, and especially when you even point out the moment where the design, the furniture design, that was co-opted by the Godrej company, and that becomes a ubiquitous chair that I think every one of us has seen in most government offices across India. So I think that kind of ties in with this idea of how the ecosystem has worked in our country, where you end with the Mahabalipuram freeze, and it just goes on to show that it's not just one definition but the other, but we are also owe our sensibilities to various influences or various cultural movements that have been absorbed at different points in time. Another point that I really found very interesting was when you say you found when you were a student, what you were taught in college and what you saw around, that disconnect, that also reverberates with me, especially when we've studied art and what we saw around, and especially when you talk about the contextual modernism, you know our books in colleges always teach you about modernist art in the context of the West, but it's only much later, and especially when we read our Professor R. Shivakumar's book, you understand that how
Exactly.
the various contextual modernist movements start within different areas in India, and they owe a lot to the vernacular, right? So these are interesting points that I really appreciated. But I would also like you to elaborate a little or talk about how you talk about this culturally neutral, minimalist, and socialist, almost dictated by a moral stance, kind of a modernist movement across the world in the post-war period, a movement that starts out with Bauhaus, but also moves to Americas as an international, design sensibility, but then also comes to India. and how that really defines, architecture, defines furniture design, it defines, a lot of the design within that era. And this is something that I have also come across in my research, and we were discussing this the other day when Tapatidi also mentioned, how an artist and designer like Riten Mazumdar, he has so many influences. Um, but also, again, interestingly, that point about, I would like you to reflect on this, and especially in the face of the idea that, you know, uh, uh, some of the basic designs that, the geometric design sensibility especially is very universal and is also understood by most cultures, as you started your lecture with that particular point, which Adrian Frutiger makes. So these are my reflections, and maybe you can take this forward. And then Tapatidi, would you like to make any suggestions
No, I
or
just add,
observations?
can I be heard? Actually, I've logged in from a
Yes, you can
completely
do that.
different place, as long as I can be heard, even if not seen properly. I was actually struck also by the point that Ushmita brought up, which is that, in a way, to put it broadly and simply, that what gets the name design in terms of both practice, pedagogy, and the profession is a new idiom of modernist design that is drawing from Ulm and Bauhaus. And that is the design training that is central to the new design institutions like NID. Even so, on one hand, they're turning to craft as a major resource, traditional resource, but at the same time, the design education is heavily drawing on what is seen as a universal language of modernism in design. I was struck by your reflection with what Kajri Jain says in the beginning of a book, Photos of, Gods in the Bazaar, where she says that she came out of NID with this modernist, minimalist sense of design. This is what designers do. And then you encountered bazaar art, and she was struck by excesses of color, of things. And you also contrasted the local signage you see with what comes up as design logo and signage. And you kind of distinguishing the two as vernacular resources and the other as modernist design. Now, I absolutely agree that what we mean by the vernacular itself has to be inflected at many levels, just like, if we think of modernism, where Nandalal can classify as a modernist as much as a Hussein can, where Jamini Rai can classify as a modernist, say, as an abstract painter like Sabwala, whatever we say. So I'm thinking whether in design, when we are thinking about a contextual history of modernism, whether the equivalents work. Because when you turn to bazaar art, or when we turn to everyday commercial signage, none of it is claiming quite a space as design. And I think this is an important move to also say that there is a hidden scheme, or there is a scheme even in every signage that goes up. And there is artistic signage, so that, when I'm looking at animal signboards of the 40s, 50s, it's commercial art, but it is partaking of a certain economy and vocabulary of design. So I'm thinking maybe the vernacular here also needs to be inflected. Yeah. Because the vernacular could be just the shop sign hoarding done by a local sign maker. It could also be the book graphic design of, say, Satyajit Ray or Signet Press, and the two don't speak to each other either, right? So it's not just that there is, so maybe the regional sphere generates its own hierarchies and layers. So I would say that book jacket design when artists and designers enter the fray, like Satyajit Ray and many others, book design becomes an art form. Yeah. But then there are many other forms of everyday forms of book design that also go. So I was wondering at what levels the vernacular also participates in a certain language of modern and modernism. And then there is something that does not even see itself as design. Yeah. So certainly what the work that Signipress is doing may not speak to a modernist language, but it sees itself as design. The work is design. But I'm thinking though whether many other things even feature within that ecosystem of design in some ways. So I'm thinking that the binary between is perhaps not so much between modernist, universal modernist design and the vernacular. Maybe it is within that domain of what we call the popular and what is more professionally practiced, whether by graphic designers in the regional languages or whether by artists or those in Shantiniketan who are using craft to develop a certain kind of design. So that's really where I wanted to come in as part of the conversation.
Just sort of, I've often been struck by, by this sort of absoluteness. One is the sort of universalism that is sort of attached to modernist design, which presumes that it can be read, it can be sort of applied across globally or in any sort of situation. But the other thing is that there is a sense of an absolute. That means that you cannot take away even a little bit or add even a little bit, because there is this ideal that there is. A particular chair reaches its ideal when it is stripped to a certain sort of form or shape, or a particular logo is stripped down, so that the mere addition of a bit of material or a bit of ink renders it no longer that ideal. So that sense of this absoluteness that is attached to international style modernism, I feel, is something that doesn't, for instance, exist in the popular and the vernacular and the regional and the contextual, because in the contextual, you are inherently accepting the fact that there is a multiple view, that the view by the reader is as much relevant as the view by the creator. So that sort of the sort of throwing away of this absoluteness, I believe, is what I mean by also an acceptance of sort of plurality, an acceptance of sort of multiplicity. And that is what sort of even Padma Kaimal sort of says, right? You can have this interpretation, you can also have this interpretation, and both of them are valid. So, and I believe that, and I've been sort of fortunate in this sort of last project that I'm working on, where I've seen various expressions towards the end of last century and the beginning of this century, where there have been incredible sort of examples of contextual modernism, which have sort of taken into account crafts, they've taken into account sort of the sustainability, not just of material, but sustainability of sort of tradition, sustainability of sort of employability and things like that. And I believe they are uniquely contextual, they're uniquely sort of regional. And it is that sort of modernism is really what sort of Tagore was also sort of talking about at one point, and which was sort of, and it required a specificity that international style modernism sort of does away or wants to do away with, so to speak.
The question I would ask here then is that I'm looking at the example of the Ahmedabad chair that you showed, which is part of the Marcel Breuer's thing, and which eventually morphs into a commercially sellable, mass-produced product. Yeah. What struck me was, and I'm thinking of experimentations with furniture design, say in Shantiniketan in Udayan by Rabindranath's son, Ratindranath, who becomes a furniture designer, where he experiments a lot with low furniture, with design, with ornamental design. Shantiniketan is one place where even in the architectural design that Surendranath called comes out, there's a distinct interpolation of ornamental motifs into fairly streamlined design. I was wondering, what does modernism have any place at all for the ornamental? So I was asking in terms of the kind of universal language of modernism that begins, which is largely of the Bauhaus lineage. Would it have room for ornamentals? Ornaments seem to be a corruption, which is, of course, an older kind of sense that excessive of ornament is corruption. In Hindu temples, it could be. I'm wondering whether there's a new language of the ornamental that could come into design. That could nonetheless partake in the language of modern design, because we know there's a lot of modern design that brings the ornamental in, takes motifs.
Totally. And I think today, again, in the last 10 odd years, you're seeing various expressions managed to bring.
I have to mute just 1 minute.
You're seeing various expressions that actually manage to bridge the sort of the language of the rectilinear sort of language of modernism, alongside a very, very an embracing of something that is ornament, or it could be ornament, it could be sort of material as well. And in furniture design, you're seeing an incredible amount of expressions that are very, very, I believe, hopeful of that, because they are sensitive to the craft. And I think that holds true not just in furniture design. I believe it will hold true in sort of other craft, in textiles as well, where there is a recognition of the sort of value of the modern, alongside a sort of an acceptance of the plurality that comes with the regional. But at the same time, there is, of course, the danger that the adoption of the modernism is a pure sort of formal and superficial one, and not an ideological one. And I think that is where and it is unfortunate that the world sort of was more enamored by the charm of the sort of minimalist style than by the sort of value of modernism as an ideology, which would allow for the equity, which would allow for the production, the sort of distribution of objects and products to the masses. And that, I believe, is where is a path that I think that's still being tread on little carefully. So you see expressions of modernist aesthetic, but not necessarily the modernist sort of ideology, the humanitarian sort of aspect. And that is actually how it was birthed. I mean, Bauhaus intentions, in all good intentions, were that.
I would like to ask, take a little segue and ask something about the, going back to the idea of the vernacular and the kind of a multiplicity of approach, and also, connected to, the design aesthetics of today. So we see a lot of typography, or a lot of, especially graphic novels coming up in a language that we identify with as Indian, within inverted commas, and it has also bled into certain art making arenas as well. So I would like to understand whether when we look at these kind of languages, are we looking at a kind of exoticization through our own eyes of our own culture, whereas earlier it was the othered, but now it is we ourselves are trying to create a desi or a brown image and coming up with design ideas which again turn us into a kind of a stereotype
I believe at least that anything that we do will inherently have some sense of the past. And the past, the popular, the vernacular, there will be a sense of that, right? So I think and I don't have the exact quote from Umberto Eco, where he sort of talks about the need to sort of be deliberate when one does it and not be innocent, meaning that deliberately reference what you do when you sort of borrow from the past. Don't do it sort of as a blind imitation. So therefore, using metaphor or sort of referencing in a deliberate way, which acknowledges and pays tribute, is a sort of a more maybe ethical way to sort of navigate that space rather than blindly imitate. Add irony is what he says, add irony, because then you're sort of being a bit more deliberate. So for instance, there have been instances where people have borrowed from calendar art or from the popular, but do it in a way that is made obvious rather than do it sort of innocently, so to speak.
We do have a few questions and observations. The first question that came up was Ujjwal Dey, who says, when there are any intersections of influences from different design traditions, can it be called a new tradition?
If there are intersections of different design traditions, like,
Yes.
Are you talking about sort of regional traditions? Or are you talking about sort of periods, sort of?
Ujjwal, if you are listening, maybe you can type in a clarification. In the meantime, he's writing both. Regional as well as global. That's what Ujjwal says.
Yeah, so you're sort of asking whether one can sort of term it. I mean, the crude one is to sort of say fusion, which is the sort of popular, which is as popular in cuisine as it is across. But I find it sometimes often incongruous when you sort of say modern artisanal, for instance. There's a certain effort to try and please everything and everybody in doing that. But at the same time, I mean, I think if one could legitimately acknowledge two different sort of influences and expressions into one, then it could possibly lead to a new sort of terminology or a stylistic sort of movement, I'm sure. If they are equally acknowledged, then both should sort of go into that terminology, I suppose.
Right. Vishal Kandelwal, who's one of our speakers, he says, thanks for this talk, Sarita. I was wondering how issues of style, modernist for instance, were discussed among students at the NID during your time at the Institute.
Practically not. It was very frankly issues of what a lot of us did. Some of us did read. Somehow all this happened in the 1980s, I find, so much happened in the 1980s. And design issues sort of came out. The Design Quarterly sort of came out in the 1980s. And that was the only place, and we were sort of lucky to have a library which had subscriptions to a lot of these magazines, more than most institutes anywhere in the world. Whether it was actually part of common at the chai discussion, not really. I think it was, we did not have a design history course. Not that I feel that it is necessary. I mean, it's fine for sort of students, I believe, to sort of go out and pick up if you can. And but the unfortunate thing was that the discussions were not so much around ideas of whether something was sort of modernist, influenced by vernacular, because at that point, to be a designer was to be a modernist. There was no question about it. And even when I sort of graduated and I worked for one of the, for Ray and Keshwan design, which epitomized really international style modernism in India, whenever we worked for the corporates, we stuck to the very, very strict, regimental, universalist sort of style thing, which would be accepted by the corporates. When we had to design postcards for our little gathering, which we call Design Friday, and I didn't pull it up right now, we would create layered designs, we would create postmodern sort of expressions, deconstructive, everything else. Maybe we didn't call it that, but they were free because we did not have to stick to what, we were not sort of designing for corporates. It's very odd. And you could see the stark contrast that existed. From the same design studio, you had this and you had that.
Interesting. We have a few questions and I will read it out.
There's a question from Indira Chaudhary and others too, which preceded Vishal's. It's coming up in my chat box. Should I read it out?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Yes, please.
Hi, Sarita. Thanks. This is from Indira. Thanks for the talk. I was wondering if you'd like to talk a little more about design pedagogy at NID, where a lot of design karigars also taught students. What did the interactions with people who had artisanal training do to you as a student? As a number of past students, I'm thinking of Jogi and Shiva and others who then go out to look at artisanal design more seriously, trying to trace the role of artisanal work played in NID's pedagogy. I would also add to it, when I visited NID, and I'm not an NID product also, but I was part of the Global Histories of Design Symposium, and we were then taken through a history of NID. They beautifully marked out the studio. And we were told that a lot of the textile design, for instance, certainly came from an artisanal tradition of weaving and design. So we were wondering, but again, with furniture design too, there would have been a coming together of artisanal skills with kind of trained professional design. So again, in a way, just like I asked the question about the place of the ornamental, how does modernism speak to artisanal practice? Or is it, I know that one can, so you can have a modernist design that can be made by anybody, but I'm thinking whether artisanal practice enters and transforms the language of modernist design from within. I'm just adding to Indira's question here.
Like you say, definitely in textile it did. And even someone like G. Upadhyay, Giu, as he was called, sort of speaks of his own sort of language being influenced by his sort of learning how to weave a charpai, for instance. At the same time, I believe, I don't think ceramics, for instance, had that. And there was discipline in ceramics. Even in furniture, the expressions and say the prototypes that were sort of looked at were the ones that came along with that Design Today exhibition, right? And which remained as part of the prototype room. At least in my batch, I know not many people actually.
Local skills of, say, the Ahmedabad wood carver who's doing these beautiful chair fronts and all, that would never come into an ID in terms of other models?
Interestingly, I think it was with one of the foundational sort of courses brought about by Mohan Bhandari, who used to be with the IDC, who actually brought together programs such as the environmental exposure and rural exposure. And that actually acknowledged and sort of facilitated a sort of the space for the class to sort of step out and look at these and examine these. But at the same time, when they did enter the discipline, there was this pressure that when you get out, you have to sort of stick to this modernist language. I don't think that sort of pressure exists in today's NID as much, especially, I mean, I've noticed, and much later when a lot of sort of, say, for instance, the bamboo crafts that came in, or the Javaja work that others sort of did with industrial design, they incorporated a lot more. And you're right, it was people like Jogi and who also sort of introduced and sort of incorporated it into the curriculum and legitimized these as expressions that one could sort of dip into, borrow from, and understand. And you could, at that point, start to acknowledge that. But there was still an expectation to sort of.
I have a kind of a observation come question, listening to this particular area of discussion, especially with regards to the post-independent time period. And you have mentioned that, you've talked about the government, especially Nehru's plans, of the industrial mass-produced design movement, which looks at non-organic or material. But around the same time, the government is also doing this craft, artisanal rehabilitation work that is part of the All India Handicraft Boards or the cottage industries or the weavers service centers. So, we have these two different languages, but they come from the same, the government, the governmental support. Whereas the corporate would have been very different. So how are these two also, contributing to what is understood as the modern design in India?
I think both of those sort of did enter into the curriculum and pedagogy of NID. Definitely they did enter. I mean, but at the same time, there was an emphasis during Nehru's sort of period of treating the factories as the temples of modern India. There was, and you can, if you sort of, and I've sort of looked, at one point you'll find a quotation from Nehru which sort of talks about sort of needing to look into this past, and actually the best place to sort of find this, and I found it, was in the Marg. There was an All India Design Council that Marg had put out. And that there is a sort of, I think, some sort of a manifesto that was created and submitted, but it did not get anywhere. And in which they actually bring up very much these very same issues on the fact that one should be sensitive to the fact that a lot of these expressions should not be pushed to the sort of background in our hurry to catch up with the world, so to speak. I forget the particular issue, but I do have a copy if anyone's interested.
Right. Tapati, would you like to read the next question?
Yeah, there's a question by Anahita Jinwala. So there are questions appearing both in the chat box and in the Q&A, right? So I'm reading the ones from the chat box. Yeah, okay. This one says, this brings to my time in Uttarakhand, where I was simultaneously referring to this very old book that discussed overshot weaving, The Joy of Hand Weaving by Usma Gallinger Todd, and discovered that Kumari weavers had a tradition of doing exactly that. The drafts weren't even written down. They were only available to me to record as they were told to me by older weavers. So that is a question. Okay. So again, it's about a kind of oral and a tradition, that design practice that grows out of just seeing and learning an apprenticeship rather than going through any model, right?
Yeah. At the same time, especially sort of during the colonial period, there was definitely a supremacy that was given to anything that was textual, anything that was written down, which is why Ayurveda was considered sort of above the local. In Kerala, we call it Natuvaidyas. And even though the Natuvaidyas never, even today, don't have an oral tradition, and the Ayurveda practitioners dip into the Natu, the traditional weavers, traditional healers' traditions, Ayurveda is considered higher in the hierarchy because it's written. So the text has over the last 300 odd years, has sort of gained supremacy, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's interesting because it ties up to the way, architectural history, for instance, became obsessed with finding Sanskrit treatises on construction, which is why Manasar becomes important. Yeah. And then they find there's a huge gap between the Brahmins who knows the treatise and the working people who have very different vocabularies. And I was looking at an early text like Ramraj's essay on the architecture of the Hindus, and he's talking about this big gap. So the Western concern with finding a canon and then with practice.
But he does, in fact, in his text, he does acknowledge the fact that there was this sort of gap between the Brahmins who did not know the practical sort of aspect,
and who didn't know the
practitioners who did not have the words to explain what they do.
And he finds himself mediating between the two. So I could think that somebody going to look at Kumani weaving tradition, carrying ideas, would also be acting as mediating between ideas and that. So in a way in which Havel is bringing out technical design, or even Journal of Indian Art and Industry under Lockwood Kipling is producing model design for the craftspeople who would not have otherwise worked with paper models.
Yeah. The problem, I believe, in that is that evolution sort of stops. Because it's not written in stone, but it's written on paper or whatever it is, and therefore the inherent quality of a folk tradition is stopped. It's sort of frozen.
It gets fixed. Yeah, it's very interesting that Alpana design was something that people did like Rangoli, ornamental. Yeah. But now you have Alpana design templates. Right? Yes. So then it becomes it's like a mass-produced thing. There's a question by Nia Thandapani. I'm interested if you would view your argument as a challenge to the notion of tropical modernism, and more broadly, your take on the adoption of this term within global design history discourse, tropical modernism.
If you view your argument as a challenge, no, I actually don't think of it as a, and I'm not very sure about this term tropical. I mean, regional modernism, yes, because it's not temperate modernism, for instance, as an example, but regional definitely. And I think what's her name? The lady from Sri Lanka sort of epitomizes this. The architect from Sri Lanka,
Minette de Silva.
Minette de Silva sort of brings about, and she's probably a tropical modernist, if you were to sort of use the term.
Well, I suppose Laurie Baker too, because you're basically making architecture to suit the weather, right? I mean, that is a very major thing which can sustain certain kinds of weather condition, I suppose, right? I don't know whether it's not a comfortable term.
It's not a comfortable term because I think it sort of, again, is a bit limiting, but I think I prefer something like regional modernism because it sort of, firstly, it allows for that cultural specificity that each geography and history and things allow for, and also for some amount of a continuation of a tradition and of skills and employability. That sustainability is something I think we disregard.
Tapati, there are a couple of questions in the Q&A box. I'll read.
Yeah, why don't you read them out?
Yeah.
Let me just
First one is from an anonymous attendee. Could you speak more on the idea of multiplicity as inconsistency, especially for someone practicing today through the medium of telematic networks like internet? One, it seems, has the opportunity to cross most boundaries that keep us grounded and rooted. And these rituals influence our everyday, identifying with the stylistic outcome and taking responsibility for the inconsistency is perhaps enacted through an identity that is no longer relevant today.
Not fully getting your question, but I think in terms of the idea of inconsistency, that's more of a sort of a negative way of, or critical way of sort of looking at the idea of multiplicity. When you sort of speak of multiplicity, you're sort of allowing for a multiplicity of thought, multiplicity of reading, multiplicity of expression. When you sort of say something is inconsistent, you're actually pushing them into a binary. And I think when you're talking about multiplicity, you're talking about an acceptance of a binary. When you're talking about inconsistency, you're sort of talking about the discomfort with binary. I think that and it's also, I believe, like I keep saying that with modernism, it's like there is only this one way, and in say postmodernism, that it is that anything goes. So I don't know if that sort of can also comments on your comment. I don't think I've answered your question, but
Yeah, I mean, I feel that perhaps, they may be asking more about the homogenization of cultures due to a kind of prolonged existence on the internet, because we've talked about design as something that comes out of our sociocultural, practices. So at least that's how the question is coming across to me. Perhaps that's what they mean.
An acceptance of sort of multiple sort of contexts and ways of seeing, I suppose.
Tanishka has a question for you, Sarita. She asks, do you think we can see the adoption of crafts coming from the Indian village within design pedagogy as part of an attempt to find a nationalist identity for design? I'm thinking of the political backdrop of the 80s and the festivals of India that took place in this decade.
I think the idea of sort of having a singular nationalist view is something that politically is fraught, culturally is fraught with sort of problems, but definitely the idea of sort of crafts as something, crafts as a sort of a general idea, as something that can be seen as an identity, and therefore as something that is adopted and something that is sort of taken along, is something that one hopes for. I do believe what in Shantiniketan and the other Niketan. Sriniketan. That's precisely what the intention was. And there are sort of interesting conversations that I think Tagore has with Gandhi as well, as to Gandhi's adoption of certain sort of, spinning as more symbolic and not really actually pulling it along into the sort of national agenda I think there was an unhappiness or sort of discomfort in possibly in the many other sort of fires that were being fought at that time. This sort of gets waylaid a little bit, I imagine. I'm sure probably Professor Shivakumar.
So, this burden of Indianness that you talked about, which artists, writers, everybody, that how does one be modern and authentically, what is the differential modern that we all represent is a baggage that all through the 20th century, nobody was really able to shed, right? Which is why, but I was really thinking that if you were to locate ourselves in the period which you are much more, which is the early years of NID and its training, There's a different kind of, I wouldn't even say burden, a different orientation towards village craft, rural form and design that Shantiniketa naturally absorbs both into its art form. So on one hand, Ajanta, on the other hand, maybe folk design comes together. And so does it at Sriniketan, even though. But I'm thinking that in NID, it seems that a modernist idiom is more sharply in place. And then the turn to craft comes almost to say that, what is the base? So the Handmade in India book, I suppose, becomes a very major project. And I've always been struck that this new moment, when all the handicraft boards and all are being set up, when a new craft economy and a new kind of governance of craft and folk art, which is different from the colonial, but ultimately borrows in that in a way, craft needs to be promoted, it needs to be preserved, it needs to be documented, and it needs to be brought into the model, to make it both creative livelihood. That's a common concern that connects the 19th century colonial art administrators with the new nationalist thing. But in the sense that that's not an easy thing to accept, to say that what NID did is just continuing with an older thing. It's not. I too accept that it is making a break at many levels. It's with a very, very different ways in which the functionalism or the artistry of what you're learning. But nonetheless, I think I think the question would be that what defines, if you don't use the term Indianness, what defines authenticity in some ways? Because Ashok Chatterjee talks about design having to serve certain needs. So when you design a bowl, when you design a chair, when you design a rug, they have certain functional needs. And you also want to bring Indian material, Indian design, Indian traditional craft and expertise into it. So I was just thinking, and I think craft is providing all of that, right? Craft is providing a living tradition and all of that. So I think we really need to, in this design history symposium, ask the question, where does the new national state and its design schemes make that big break from colonial art administration? I mean, we know that they embrace modernism, and that is important, but in its engagement with artisanal arts and crafts, what is the break? And I'm still trying to understand, but those of you who've been trained at NID can provide a much more grounded sense of what that learning, because Ashok Chatterjee said you learn from them, but it's not an innocent learning. You're coming with your own kind of profession. I think that is something, I don't think there's an easy answer, but I think we would all have to address that hierarchy and yet a dialogue that is essential.
Yeah, I think there's this search for an ideal. The search for this is something that is core to any sort of creative activity, whether it is this ideal that was sort of formed Plato-like or in the international style, or even Vishwakarma sort of says there is that rupa, the form that you kind of aspire to create. So it depends on which sort of aspiration sort of you go for. But in terms of, I often feel that the need for creating a singular national identity is not the answer. A singular national design identity is not something that we can produce so easily, or need to, for that matter.
Thank you, Sarita. It was a wonderful session. Thanks.
There are a couple of more questions. If we can quickly just go through those before we come to the end of the session.
Where have they come up? In the chat box?
This is Anjan Chakravorty, says, would be interested to know the visual design language that early designers followed when creating palm leaf books or say far paintings or brass relief artworks, which usually combined text and visuals?
Yeah, what is the visual design language? I mean, I think like in any craft form, there were rules in place in terms of proportion, form, choice of material, the selection of a particular tool that determined the way in which the visual language would follow. They were not, again, like somebody in the chat sort of said, they were not sort of written rules in place, but were handed down through a tradition of sort of apprenticeship, I suppose. Yeah.
And then Anjan again asks another question. The fact international designers as well as Indian designers trained in modern design aesthetics appreciated Indian traditional arts and graphic forms meant that traditional Indian design also followed certain Indian art and visual styles which appealed to our sensibilities many years later. I think more than a question, that's
A statement.
an
But I don't
observation.
completely agree. I don't think that the following of Indian sort of art or visual styles was prompted by a recognition by the West. I think there has been an inherent sort of appreciation of which, and there was patronage after all. There was a system of patronage that was in place, which allowed for the appreciation of a lot of the art forms.
Yeah.
I don't think it was dependent on a Western legitimizing of it.
I think that brings us to the last observation and question. Thank you, Sarita, for a wonderful session. And I think we've had a wonderful discussion which has thrown up some important points. And what Tapatidi mentions in the end, I think towards the end, is something very important. This idea of what is authentic and how the national state and its scheme and where does it make a break away from the idea of the colonial design versus what is then
Yes.
perhaps more of a I wouldn't say vernacular, but a more of a design, Indian design aesthetics. So we hope to keep conversing on this to our next sessions. Tomorrow we have Professor Rebecca Brown, who will speak on displaying time, displaying design, revisiting the festivals of India. It will take the format of a conversation with Tapatidi here.
Well, she'll actually present a 40-minute paper.
Okay.
And
Wonderful.
then, so it will very much be in this format.
Okay.
She will speak for her.
Okay.
I hope you've been able to do a trial session with her, or you'll be doing one tomorrow.
Yes.
Oh. Thank you, Sarita. That was wonderful. We met a long time ago.
Yes, we did.
Reconnect.
Yes. Okay.
Again, giving our thanks to our outreach partners, NID and Jadunath Bhavan Museum and Research Center, Kolkata, and Tapatidi. And we have some brilliant speakers yet to come. So please, those who haven't registered and maybe listening in on Facebook, please do. We do have sessions by Professor Shivakumar, Nancy Adajania, Vishal Khandelwal, Mortimer Chatterjee, and a sum up by Tapatidi towards the end of next month.
I'm not so sure I'll be able to sum up this diversity of ideas, but nonetheless, I think it would be good to have some kind of joint session where we all think of it together, just the panelists. I think it may work best that way. Okay, bye.
Thanks
Bye.
so
Have
much.
a good evening.
Thank you. Okay, have a good weekend, whatever's left of it. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.